It started as just another cold Colorado night at the end of October 2001. On Riverview Lane, in the small town of Brookfield Springs, the Coopers looked like every other middle-class family on the block. Daniel ran a heating and air company. Melissa was a respected middle school vice principal. Their kids, Lily and Noah, were doing what American kids do: college, homework, sports, weekend drives back home. By Friday morning, both parents had vanished. Their cars were still in the garage. Wallets, phones, IDs, all left behind. Last night's dinner still on the table. No signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. No trail leaving the house. Just a quiet, locked home and two adults who were suddenly gone. For years, people whispered theories: debt, an affair, witness protection, a secret plan to start over somewhere else. But the truth was much closer than anyone wanted to believe. Because the person who killed Daniel and Melissa Cooper wasn't a stranger in the dark. It was the woman everyone trusted. The school counselor. Melissa's best friend. Their kid's second mom. This is the story of the Riverview Lane double homicide. If cases like this matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if the safest person in your life became the prime suspect? Brookfield Springs, Colorado was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted things to slow down. About 7,200 residents, an hour's drive from Denver. Rows of single-family homes with fenced yards and mailboxes that everyone recognized. The streets on the east side curved into quiet cul-de-sacs where kids rode bikes until the porch lights came on. Violent crime was rare enough that when it did happen, people remembered the date. Most calls to the local police were about noise, traffic complaints, or the occasional break-in by a teenager testing boundaries. The Brookfield Springs Police Department reflected that rhythm. A modest building, a small roster of officers, and a department more accustomed to writing reports about fender benders than processing homicide scenes. People left their doors unlocked during the day. They knew the officers by name and waved when patrol cars rolled past. At 1435 Riverview Lane, the Cooper family had fit neatly into that picture since 1995. Their house was a two-story, light-colored home with an attached garage and a finished basement. Behind the property line, a line of trees followed a small creek that swelled in spring and ran low by late summer. Neighbors were used to the sight of Daniel Cooper's work truck in the driveway and seasonal decorations on the front porch: pumpkins in October, lights at Christmas, flags in July. From the outside, the Cooper home looked like a typical middle-class success story. The lawn stayed trimmed, the siding was maintained, and the trash bins went to the curb like clockwork every week. One neighbor would later say, they were just normal, the kind of family you don't worry about. No one looking at that house in 2001 would have guessed it would one day be a case file code instead of a simple address. Daniel Cooper was 49 years old in the fall of 2001. He owned a small HVAC company, Cooper Heating and Air, LLC, serving the homes and small businesses of Brookfield Springs and the surrounding area. His name appeared on magnets stuck to local refrigerators and on invoices tucked into kitchen drawers. Clients described him as reliable, straightforward, the kind of contractor who showed up on time and didn't push unnecessary repairs. One longtime customer told investigators later, "If Dan said your furnace needed a part, it needed a part. He wasn't a talker, but he was solid. Daniel's work followed him home. The basement at Riverview Lane doubled as his storage and paperwork hub. Shelves held filters, fittings, and tools. Boxes stored paper invoices and service records. On many nights, a light glowed down there while he caught up on billing or planned routes for the next day. It was his space, separated from the rest of the house by a door at the top of the stairs. Melissa Cooper, 46, spent most of her days at Brookfield Springs Middle School as the assistant principal. Her job was less about long vacations and more about discipline referrals, scheduling, and making sure teachers had what they needed to do their work. She was the person called to the hallway when a fight broke out, the one who met with frustrated parents and tired staff. Colleagues described her as firm but fair, the administrator who knew the rules and expected them to be followed, but who listened before she decided on consequences. Her schedule ran long. It wasn't unusual for her to stay after hours for parent conferences, staff meetings, or student issues that spilled past the final bell. At home, she was the one who kept calendars synced, tuition payments on time, and school forms signed. The Cooper children were at two very different stages of life. Lily, 21, was living in a dorm at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, studying business. She came home for holidays and some weekends when her work and class load allowed it. Friends knew her as focused and protective of her younger brother. Noah, 16, was still at home, attending Brookfield Springs High School. His life revolved around homework, friends, and typical teenage routines. Music, maybe a sport or a club, occasional frustration with rules, but no serious trouble. From the outside, the family dynamic appeared steady. They had dinners together when the schedules lined up, celebrated milestones, and did the small routines that neighbors notice, scraping ice off windshields on cold mornings, unloading groceries on Saturdays, backing cars out of the driveway around the same times each weekday. There were no police reports of shouting in the night, no public scenes, no visible fractures that suggested imminent collapse. Their background, on paper, looked clean. None of the Coopers had a criminal record. There were no documented domestic violence calls to 1435 Riverview Lane, no prior welfare checks by law enforcement or social services. Child Protective Services had never been involved with the family. To the agencies that track risk factors, this was a low-risk household in a low-crime town. Financially, they were stable in the way many middle-class families try to be. They had a mortgage on the house, but their payments were current. Their credit cards showed regular use, groceries, gas, school expenses, but no pattern of desperate charges, no sudden maxed-out limits or collection notices. Daniel's recent HVAC contract for a new housing development promised additional income, easing some of the usual worries about bills and tuition. In the middle of that picture stood Karen Whitfield. At 48, she was a school counselor at the same middle school where Melissa worked. The two women had been close friends for about 20 years. Co-workers were used to seeing them together in the hallways, and neighbors were used to seeing Karen's sedan parked outside the Cooper home around dinners and weekends. Lily and Noah called her Aunt Karen, even though there was no blood relation. She attended school events with them, joined family barbecues, and, according to multiple witnesses, was trusted as if she were part of the family. For most people in Brookfield Springs, if you knew Melissa, you knew Karen. One teacher later told investigators, "They were a team. If you saw one, you usually saw the other within a few minutes." Beneath that steady surface, however, there were small details that would only stand out later. Within 6 months leading up to the disappearance,
Melissa quietly shared a concern with a colleague about the school's Student Assistance Fund, a pool of money meant to help struggling students with meals, supplies, or emergency needs. She mentioned seeing strange numbers in the records. What was written on internal paperwork didn't seem to fully match some of the bank entries and receipts. She hadn't yet filed a formal complaint, but she had begun marking discrepancies. One teacher recalled Melissa saying, "If I file this report the way I think I should, someone is going to be in serious trouble." She didn't name that someone, and life at school went on as usual, bells ringing, students moving from class to class, meetings scheduled and completed. Around the same time, Daniel made a financial move that would later draw attention. About a week before the Coopers vanished, he withdrew $8,000 in cash from the family's bank account. When his younger brother asked about it, Daniel explained that it was for home repairs and to get ahead on Lily's tuition. On its face, that answer made sense. College was not cheap, and houses always found ways to cost money. But in the weeks that followed, there was no contractor invoice, no visible renovation, no new roof or major appliance. Mental health records did not suggest that the Coopers were preparing for a drastic change or escape. Neither Melissa nor Daniel had prescriptions for antidepressants or antipsychotic medications. They weren't in therapy for severe psychiatric issues. Friends and coworkers did not recall them talking about running away, starting over somewhere else, or ending their lives. They appeared as many adults do in their late 40s, tired sometimes, stressed about work and money at times, but functioning, planning, and moving forward. By late October 2001, the Cooper family looked like any other family in Brookfield Springs. A hard-working father running a small business, a dedicated assistant principal, a college-aged daughter figuring out her future, and a teenage son navigating high school. A close family friend who seemed to be a steady support. A house on a quiet street with a creek out back.
But in the background were two threads that would later define the entire case file. A school administrator worried about unexplained numbers in a student fund, and a business owner who had just pulled thousands of dollars in cash with no clear paper trail. Together, they formed the last known foundation of what seemed like a stable life at 1435 Riverview Lane. Just before a single October night, turned that address into the center of a missing persons investigation that would haunt Brookfield Springs for more than 2 decades. It is Thursday evening, October 25th, 2001, in Brookfield Springs, Colorado. A regular school night, work in the morning, nothing on the calendar that should stand out. Inside the Cooper home at 1435 Riverview Lane, 3 people are moving through a familiar routine. Daniel, 49, Melissa, 46, and their 16-year-old son, Noah. Their daughter Lily is an hour away in Fort Collins, holed up in her dorm room with textbooks and midterm notes spread across her desk, assuming her parents are doing exactly what they always do on a weeknight: eating dinner, watching some TV, going to bed early. Sometime in the early evening, a neighbor across the street notices a silver sedan turning onto Riverview Lane. It's a car they recognize instantly. Karen Whitfield's sedan rolls to a stop in the Cooper driveway. To the neighborhood, Karen isn't just another visitor. She's Melissa's closest friend, a school counselor at the same middle school where Melissa works, and she's been in and out of this house for years. The neighbor watches her get out, walk up the front path, and disappear inside the home. No one else arrives. No delivery trucks, no unfamiliar vehicles. Just Karen. By that neighbor's estimate, Karen stays in the house for roughly 30 to 40 minutes. The curtains are drawn so there's no clear view of what's going on inside. The only clues are silhouettes passing by a window and faint tones of conversation. Then, as quietly as she arrived, Karen leaves. Her sedan backs out of the driveway, pulls away and disappears down Riverview Lane. As far as the neighbor can tell, that is the last time anyone outside the Cooper family sees her at the house that night. On the other side of the property line, the neighbor in the adjoining house notices something else. They're used to the Cooper home being calm, the kind of place where you hear a TV, a dishwasher, maybe muffled laughter, but not much more. That evening, for a brief window, something sounds off. They hear voices from the living room that are, in their words, louder than usual. It doesn't go on long, under 10 minutes, but it's sharp enough to stand out in their memory later. They can't make out the words and they can't swear who is speaking. What they don't hear is just as important. No crash of furniture, no obvious scream, no repeated thuds that would trigger a 911 call. Just raised voices, then quiet again. At the dinner table, Noah feels the same shift in tone, even if he doesn't fully understand it. Years later, speaking with investigators, he describes the meal as more tense than normal. The food is ordinary weeknight food, but the conversation is not. His parents talk about money, the usual pressure points of bills, upcoming expenses, the cost of Lily's tuition and Daniel's business. Embedded in that, Melissa brings up something that catches Noah's attention. Even if he doesn't have the full context, she mentions something at school I have to deal with. And it's clear she's not talking about a typical student discipline issue or a parent complaint. She doesn't give details, and the topic doesn't turn into a shouting match at the table. But the air feels heavier than it usually does on the Thursday night. When the meal ends, the family doesn't clear the table in their usual thorough way. Noah takes his plate to the kitchen, but the table itself is left partially uncleared, glasses still out, some utensils in place, remnants of dinner cooling on the surface. It's a small detail that later becomes a frozen image in the case file. A meal interrupted, normal routine breaking in the smallest of ways. After dinner, the family scatters into their usual spaces. Daniel heads down to the basement. For him, that lower level isn't just storage. It's where he keeps tools, paperwork, and records for Cooper Heating and Air. It's where he sorts invoices, tracks jobs, and sometimes tinkers late into the night. He is used to being down there alone. Melissa stays on the main floor, moving between the dining area and the kitchen, running water in the sink, putting away leftovers, starting to clean up, but not quite finishing. Upstairs, for a while, the house is still. Phone company records later show that after dinner, the landline goes quiet. There are no outgoing calls from the Cooper home to friends, family, or work. There are no incoming calls to the house number from that point up through midnight. Lily's phone does not light up with any calls from her parents. She doesn't receive a quick check-in from her mother, even though that's something that often happens on ordinary nights when exams are near. Outside, both family vehicles stay exactly where they are supposed to be. Daniel's work pickup truck and Melissa's sedan sit in the garage, unmoved. No one in the neighborhood reports hearing the garage door open late at night. No headlights sweep across the street, indicating a car leaving or returning. Later, when investigators comb through toll records, gas station logs, and any available travel data, they find nothing to suggest that either of those vehicles left Brookfield Springs that night. Around 10 to 10:30 p.m., Noah retreats to his room on the second floor. For a 16-year-old in 2001, this means music, homework, maybe a few messages from friends. He puts on headphones, turning up the volume enough
that the sounds of the house blur into a low hum. He stays in his room until he drifts off to sleep sometime before midnight. When asked later, he says he doesn't remember hearing any doors opening, any footsteps coming up the stairs, or any unusual movement after he went up. Downstairs and out back, someone else notices a detail that will later stand out in the case file. A neighbor whose yard backs onto the creek behind the Coopers' home glances out their window late that night. They notice that a light is still on in the Cooper basement long after the rest of the house appears dark. To them, it's strange. On school nights, that house usually goes quiet earlier. The neighbor doesn't see anyone moving in the windows. They don't hear anything alarming. They register the oddity, then go about their own night, not realizing how important that basement light will become decades later. Across the block and around the corner, the rest of Brookfield Springs moves through another ordinary Thursday. Children finish homework, parents pack lunches, local TV stations roll through their late evening news. There are no 911 calls tied to 1435 Riverview Lane. Police patrol logs show no officers dispatched for noise complaints, disturbances, or suspicious activity on that street. No one reports an unfamiliar car parked outside the Cooper home after Karen's sedan is seen leaving earlier in the evening. On paper, it's a calm night in a quiet town. What's missing is as important as what is recorded. There are no emails sent from Daniel or Melissa that night. No notes are left in the kitchen or by the phone. Lily doesn't wake up to a voicemail. She goes to bed in Fort Collins assuming her parents are in their own rooms, the way they always are. When investigators later try to reconstruct those hours, they find a clear line of activity that suddenly stops. Phone logs, sighting reports, and family accounts all taper off around late evening, leaving a blank space where a family's last normal hours should be. Neighbors would later tell detectives versions of the same thing. Nothing happened at that house that was loud enough, long enough, or strange enough to make them pick up a phone. One of them recalls, "If I'd heard a real fight or someone screaming, of course I would have called. It just didn't sound like that at the time." In other words, whatever unfolded inside 1435 Riverview Lane after those raised voices faded, it unfolded quietly enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. By the time the house finally settles into darkness, except for that basement light reported after midnight, Daniel and Melissa are last firmly placed inside their own home, while Noah sleeps behind a closed bedroom door upstairs. Karen Whitfield, the trusted friend and school counselor, is the only non-family member confirmed to have been inside the house that evening. When the sun rises over Brookfield Springs on October 26th, the Coopers' cars, wallets, and daily lives will all still be rooted at 1435 Riverview Lane. But from this night forward, Daniel and Melissa themselves will never again be seen alive. On the morning of October 26, 2001, the first alarm didn't ring inside the Cooper house. It rang at work. Daniel Cooper was supposed to be on a job site early, the kind of appointment he almost never missed. He prided himself on being the contractor who showed up when he said he would. When he didn't arrive and didn't call, his crew tried his cell phone. No answer. They tried the house. Still nothing. One of the technicians later told police, "For Dan not to call? That was the first moment I knew something was off."
Across town at Brookfield Springs Middle School, the staff office was having the same experience. Melissa Cooper, the assistant principal who was always on campus before the first bell, simply didn't show up. She hadn't emailed to say she'd be late. She hadn't called. There was no note on the schedule. A teacher would later tell investigators she was the kind of person who would call if she was going to be 10 minutes late. Silence just wasn't her. The school secretary dialed the Cooper house repeatedly that morning. Each time, the phone rang out with no answer, no voicemail pickup, no machine message. A colleague tried Melissa's personal cell phone. The line was either out of service or powered off. Inside the school's email system, there were no messages from her after the previous afternoon. It was as if both Daniel and Melissa had fallen out of their own routines overnight. By late morning, Brookfield Springs High School became involved. Staff there had been informed that nobody could reach Noah's parents. They called Noah to the office, explained that his mom hadn't come to work. His dad hadn't shown up at a job, and no one was answering the home phone. Noah agreed to go home and check. Whether he was driven or walked, what matters is that by late morning, he was standing at the front door of 1435 Riverview Lane with his own key in his hand. When Noah stepped into the house, the first thing he noticed was the quiet. The television wasn't on. The radio wasn't playing. No one called out to him. He moved through the main floor calling, "Mom? Dad?" There was no response. The second thing he noticed was the table. The dining area still held the remains of last night's meal. Plates, glasses, and food that hadn't been cleared. It looked like a family dinner that had ended suddenly and never been cleaned up. Nothing was overturned. No chairs were knocked over, no cabinet doors hung open. The living room and kitchen were in order, the way his parents usually kept them. There were no shattered windows, no broken picture frames, no obvious sign that someone had forced their way into the house or that a struggle had taken place. That absence made the scene more unsettling, not less. Everything looked normal, but Daniel and Melissa were nowhere inside the part of the house Noah could see. Noah did what most 16-year-olds would do in that moment. He reached for the phone and called his older sister. Lily picked up in her dorm room in Fort Collins. When he asked if she'd heard from their parents, she told him she hadn't. No late-night call, no morning check-in, no email. For Lily, who had been juggling midterms, that silence didn't fit either. Both siblings knew their parents could be busy or distracted. They did not vanish. On the phone, they went over the same points. The cars should be there, the house was locked, nobody was answering, and neither parent had called in sick to work. It was at this point that it stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like an emergency. Brookfield Springs Middle School, the high school, and the Cooper children all came to the same conclusion. They needed help. A call went into the Brookfield Springs Police Department requesting a welfare check for Daniel and Melissa Cooper at 1435 Riverview Lane. The dispatcher logged it as a concern about a married couple who had missed work, failed to answer phones, and left their teenage son with no explanation. Detective Mark Ellison, a local investigator used to small-town problems, shoplifting, domestic disputes, the occasional DUI, was sent to respond, along with a patrol officer. When they pulled into Riverview Lane late that morning or early that afternoon, the neighborhood looked calm. Lawns were trimmed. Kids' bikes were in driveways. The Coopers' mailbox wasn't stuffed, suggesting they hadn't been gone long. The front door of the house was locked. Through the glass, Ellison could see a tidy entryway. No splintered wood, no kicked-in frame. Noah met the officers outside and explained he had a spare key. He unlocked the door and stepped aside so they could enter first. Inside, Ellison's initial impression matched Noah's. Everything was in its place, almost too much so. Coats hung on their hooks. Shoes were lined up near the door. The air felt still. On a key rack just inside, Ellison noticed the main set of house keys, something that wouldn't be there if Daniel and Melissa had driven off together for a trip or an errand. Moving deeper into the main floor, Ellison took in the dining area and kitchen. The dinner dishes and leftover food from the night before were still sitting out. It looked like everyone had gotten up from the table and simply never returned. There were no signs that someone had packed a suitcase or prepared food to go. No trash bags waiting by the door, no luggage by the stairs. He and the officer checked the usual locations for valuables and personal items that might give a clue about a planned absence. Wallets were found inside the house, along with Daniel's driver's license, Melissa's ID, and their credit cards. 2 older model cell phones, early 2000s-era devices, not yet as essential as they'd later become, were also located. These were items the couple normally took with them if they planned to leave for any length of time. Their work bags were present as well. Melissa's school bag, with papers and administrative files, and Daniel's folder, with handwritten invoices and notes. Nothing indicated they had left voluntarily for a trip or a reset. And yet, they were gone. As Ellison moved toward the hallway that led down to the basement, he noticed a faint smell. It was not strong, but it was there. A light scent of cleaning product, like floor cleaner or diluted bleach. He made a mental note and later wrote it in his report. In 2001, without obvious blood or damage to guide him, he interpreted it as ordinary household cleaning. The basement was not, at that moment, subjected to advanced chemical testing or deep forensic processing. It was walked, looked at, and left. A careful pass through the rest of the house turned up no visible blood, no drag marks on floors, no overturned furniture or signs of a fight. On the second floor, bedrooms looked as expected. Beds made or unmade in familiar ways, personal items where they usually sat. There were no discarded suitcases, no open drawers suggesting hurried packing. In the attached garage, both family vehicles were present. The tires didn't appear freshly caked with mud. There were no signs someone had just driven in or out. They checked for signs of travel planning, airline itineraries, bus tickets, printed confirmations. There were none. Bank statements lying around did not show sudden cash dumps into accounts elsewhere. From a purely physical standpoint, it looked as though Daniel and Melissa had simply stepped out of their lives for a moment and failed to return. Later, in a follow-up report, Ellison would sum up his first impression with a simple line. It looked like they had simply stepped out for a minute and never came back. Given everything he had seen, the missing couple, their cars still home, their wallets and phones inside, the lack of communication with work and their children, Ellison knew this could not be treated as a casual disappearance. This was not a case where stressed parents had left a note and disappeared for a weekend. There was no note. There was nothing. He made the decision to open a formal case file. The disappearance of Daniel and Melissa Cooper was entered into the system under the identifier BS 2001-092 and classified as missing persons, suspicious circumstances. That label mattered. It meant that, from day one, this was not just about people who might have chosen to walk away. It was about people who, based on the evidence, probably hadn't had a choice. Part 3 of the story closes on that moment. The house at 1435 Riverview Lane standing quiet, the table still set from last night, and a police file just beginning to collect pages. The initial walkthrough has raised more questions than it answered, about the basement, about the timeline, about who knew what Melissa had been worried about at school. Those questions would drive the next stage of the investigation, when detectives stepped outside the Cooper home and into the lives, motives, and stories of everyone connected to them. The wider investigation into the disappearance of Daniel and Melissa Cooper really begins with their everyday lives. Detectives start at Cooper Heating and Air LLC,
the small HVAC company Daniel owns. They sit down with his technicians, office staff, and a handful of longtime customers. Everyone gives roughly the same picture. Daniel is the reliable guy who actually shows up on time, finishes the job, and writes everything down on paper. One client tells investigators, "If Daniel said he'd be there at 8, you could set your watch by him." No one reports angry confrontations on job sites, threats over unpaid bills, or heated arguments with suppliers. When detectives dig into the business side, they find late invoices and the usual cash flow headaches of a small company, but there is no sign of loan sharks, organized crime, or dangerous debt collection.
From there, the focus shifts to Brookfield Springs Middle School, where Melissa works as assistant principal. Investigators speak with the principal, teachers, office staff, and a few support workers who see her every day. They hear that Melissa has always been firm, structured, and professional, the kind of administrator who stays late to finish reports rather than leave them for the next morning. In the months before she vanished, staff noticed she seemed more tense and tired, often with a stack of folders on her desk well after regular hours. Several colleagues emphasized that this strain seemed tied to paperwork and numbers, rather than to gossip about her marriage. One teacher remembers her saying, "If I turn this report in the way it is, somebody's going to be in serious trouble." A sentence that stands out when detectives hear it repeated. That comment leads investigators to a specific area, the Student Assistance Fund. It is a small internal fund intended to help kids who cannot afford field trip fees, lunch money, or basic supplies. On paper, it is not a huge budget, but it touches many students. Detectives learn that Melissa co-manages the fund along with school administration and office staff, including her close friend Karen Whitfield. When they review the paper files, they notice small gaps. Some handwritten logs list amounts that do not clearly match corresponding reimbursement forms. A few entries appear out of sequence. The numbers are not massive, and the record-keeping is partly manual, so early on the mismatches are treated as a detail to note, not as proof of a financial crime. Still, it is enough for the Student Assistance Fund to become a highlighted line in the case file, flagged as a possible thread to pull if the investigation stalls. While police work through the professional side of the Coopers' lives, they also spent time with Lily and Noah, trying to understand the family dynamics inside 1435 Riverview Lane. Lily explains that her parents occasionally argued about money, the cost of tuition, business expenses, normal household bills. But she never heard them talk about affairs, divorce, or one of them wanting to walk away. Noah backs that up and adds that raised voices usually came when his dad was stressed about contracts or when unexpected expenses popped up. He tells investigators he never saw his father push, hit, or threaten his mother, and never saw his mother act violently toward his father. Both siblings are clear on one point. There were no plans to move out of state, sell the house, or separate as a couple. Nobody in the home talked about starting over somewhere else, or disappearing from their own lives. Detectives then take a harder look at the family's finances. They subpoena bank records and credit card statements for the months leading up to October 25, 2001. Except for Daniel's recent $8,000 cash withdrawal, the accounts look ordinary. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, gas, insurance, and college-related charges for Lily. There are no large purchases of airline tickets, bus passes, or hotel stays. No moving company deposits. No wire transfers to out-of-state accounts. Credit cards show regular use but are not pushed to the limit. There is no sign of an emergency spending spree, or the kind of financial pattern that suggests someone gearing up to run. At the house itself, police return for a more careful search of the yard and outbuildings. They walk the perimeter of the property, note sight lines to neighboring homes, and enter the small shed in the backyard. Inside, they find what you would expect from a homeowner who runs a construction-related business: tools, leftover paint, boxes of screws and building supplies. Nothing stands out as freshly used to hide a crime. The ground near the patio and along the fence line is checked visually for disturbed soil, but there are no obvious new mounds or cut turf. Without clear indicators, they do not begin digging or bringing in heavy equipment. On the surface, the property gives them nothing: no weapon, no bloody clothing, and no hastily buried object waiting close to the house. To try to trace where Daniel and Melissa might have gone, a canine team is brought in. Handlers have the dog scent items belonging to both adults, and then walk the animal through the house and around the property. The dog shows some interest near the stairway that leads to the basement and around the back door, but the handler later describes the alerts as weak and not definitive. There is no clear scent trail leading down the driveway and onto the street, and nothing that points toward a specific sidewalk or walking path. Without a strong hit showing a direction of travel, the canine search becomes another effort that raises questions, but does not offer clear answers.
Beyond the immediate yard, search teams move to the natural areas bordering Riverview Lane. Volunteers and officers walk the line of trees behind the houses, following the small creek that runs behind the Cooper property. They carefully scan the banks and brush for pieces of clothing, personal items, disturbed earth, or signs that something heavy was dragged. The search widens to include nearby walking paths and small park areas just beyond the subdivision. Despite the effort, they do not find a body, a weapon, or anything they can directly tie to Daniel or Melissa. The creek and woods, places residents might have imagined would give up a clue, offer none. As time passes, investigators widen their checks beyond Brookfield Springs. They contact state transit officials and major bus lines, verifying whether tickets were bought under the Coopers' names during the days around their disappearance. No record comes back linking them to intercity buses or trains. Over the following months, DMV and Social Security systems are monitored for new driver's licenses, job applications, or other official records that might show the Coopers resurfacing under their own identities in another part of the country. Nothing appears. The working theory becomes that, if they did leave town alive, they did not do it in a way that leaves easy paper or digital traces. Back at the school, attention circles around to Karen Whitfield, not as a suspect yet, but as an important witness. Detectives sit down with her because she is Melissa's closest friend, a fellow staff member, and one of the last people known to be inside the Cooper home on October 25th. Karen confirms she visited early that evening and says they talked about students, schedules, and the usual family updates. She admits she helps Melissa with paperwork for the Student Assistance Fund, but tells investigators everything is by the book and that any stress Melissa felt was probably from being overworked. Given the lack of hard evidence tying her to a crime, Karen is initially treated as a friend helping the children cope, someone inside the circle, rather than someone to build a case against. Outside the formal interviews and evidence logs, the town begins to do what small towns often do when something terrible and unexplained happens. It talks. As days turn into weeks, rumors take root. Some residents quietly suggest that Daniel must have had secret debts or angry business partners who took care of the problem. Others say Melissa stumbled onto something ugly in the school finances and was silenced for it. Tips come into the police about a strange car
parked near Riverview Lane, or someone arguing near the creek late that week. But when officers try to follow up, there is no physical evidence, no video, and no second witness to confirm these stories. Each tip starts with promise and ends with a dead end. By the time this phase of the investigation winds down, detectives know far more about who Daniel and Melissa Cooper were, but still nothing solid about where they went or exactly what was done to them. They see hints of a financial irregularity at a middle school fund, a very trusted friend with access to both the family and the money, and a house that, at first glance, shows no obvious signs of a violent crime. Yet there is still no body, no confirmed crime scene, and not a single suspect they can reasonably charge. Part 4 closes with the case spread wide but losing momentum, the file thick with interviews and theories, and the central mystery still intact, setting the stage for what happens when time passes and a missing person investigation begins to slide toward cold case status. 9 months pass after Daniel and Melissa Cooper are last seen inside their home on Riverview Lane, and almost nothing about the case changes in the official files. The dates on reports move forward, new pages get stapled in, but the core questions stay exactly the same. Where did they go? How did they leave? And who helped make them disappear? In the early months, the Cooper file sits on Detective Mark Ellison's desk every day. He calls back witnesses, revisits old notes, and rereads his own first impressions. As time goes on, the case doesn't close, but it slowly slides from the top of the pile to somewhere in the middle. New burglaries, assaults, and domestic cases come in. The phone keeps ringing. The disappearance of Daniel and Melissa is still there, but it is no longer the only thing demanding his attention.
Inside the Brookfield Springs Police Department, there is a formal meeting about what to do next. Supervisors review the steps taken so far: the house search, the creek search, the interviews at the school and the HVAC company, the canine deployment, the financial checks. Everyone agrees on the same basic fact: there are no active, workable leads left to chase. The Cooper file is officially shifted from an active, frontline investigation to a status where officers monitor for new information. Ellison remains listed as the primary detective, but he is officially assigned to other incoming cases as well. The message is clear, without anyone saying it outright. Unless something new appears, this case is going to sit. While the paperwork changes, life around the case has to move. For Noah, that change is literal. With his parents still missing and no timeline for answers, arrangements are made for him to leave Brookfield Springs. Guardianship paperwork is completed, and he moves to Loveland, Colorado, to live with his maternal grandparents. Brookfield Springs High School transfers his records, closes out his file, and notes the reason: parents missing, relocation to relatives. The house at 1435 Riverview Lane no longer has a child sleeping in one of the upstairs bedrooms. It is a family home in name only. Lily tries to keep going at Colorado State University. She is a business major on paper, but in real life, she is also now a part-time employee, taking on more shifts just to stay enrolled. Any money that Daniel and Melissa set aside for her tuition is stuck in place because the owners of the accounts are neither confirmed alive nor declared dead. When she calls the police department for updates, she hears the same calm explanation again and again. The case is open. There just isn't anything new right now. One staff member remembers her asking, "So what does that mean? You're just waiting for something to fall out of the sky?" No one has a good answer for that. The house itself becomes another problem. Because Daniel and Melissa are missing,
The law does not treat them as dead, and that means the property cannot simply be sold, divided, or passed on. Under Colorado rules, 1435 Riverview Lane is placed under temporary asset supervision. The front door is still locked. Certain areas inside, including the basement, are restricted so that if new forensic work is ever approved, the scene is not contaminated more than it already has been. The home is preserved not as a place to live, but as a location that might someday be treated as a crime scene again. Outside the walls of the police department, people in Brookfield Springs do not forget right away. Volunteer search efforts continue through the following spring and summer. Community members and local officers meet on weekends, divide into groups, and walk new stretches of parkland, older walking trails, and empty fields farther from town. They check ditches, ravines, and old sheds on the outskirts. Every time they come back with nothing they can link to Daniel or Melissa. No clothing, no ID, no weapon, no clear sign that the couple ever passed through those places. As the official updates slow down, rumors pick up. In coffee shops, grocery store lines, and after church, people build their own versions of the story. Some insist that Daniel must have had secret debts, that someone in a dark truck or an unmarked car came to collect. Others are sure that Melissa discovered something serious in the school finances and was silenced for it. A teacher later recalls telling a detective, "People talked like they knew, but really they were just filling in the blanks because nobody could stand not having a reason." None of the community theories come with documents, photos, or trustworthy witnesses. They live in conversations, not in evidence logs. Now and then the police tip line lights up again. A caller says they saw a mystery car parked near Riverview Lane on a night in late October 2001. Another claims they heard an argument down by the creek around that time. Detectives try to follow up. They check license plates when they have them, ask for more precise times, and cross-check with any old patrol logs. Each promising detail breaks down on closer look. The plate number does not exist, or belongs to a local resident with a harmless reason to be there. The date or hour the caller remembers does not match the weather, the school schedule, or other verified events. The Cooper file grows thicker with tip sheets that raise questions, but do not answer any.
Behind the scenes, law enforcement also watches for a quieter kind of signal: movement in government and employment databases. Over the next 2 years, they monitor whether Daniel or Melissa use their social security numbers to apply for new jobs, renew driver's licenses, file tax returns, or seek public benefits in Colorado or another state. Nothing appears. There are no new applications, no fresh employment records, no updates to official files that show them starting life somewhere else under their own names. The absence of activity is disturbing, but it still stops short of legal proof that they are dead. Time continues to move forward. For Lily and Noah, contact with the police becomes less frequent. They still call when an anniversary approaches or when a rumor reaches them, but more and more often, they already know what they're going to hear before they dial. The answer is polite and steady. The case is not closed. There are just no leads that can be worked right now. On paper, the investigation is alive. In practice, it is stalled. Back in Brookfield Springs, Karen Whitfield never leaves the scene in the way the Coopers do. She continues her work as a school counselor at the middle school. When small memorial gatherings or in memory of mentions for Daniel and Melissa are held, she attends. She is the friend who can talk about Melissa's years in the school office, about Daniel fixing their furnace one cold winter, about Lily and Noah as kids. To many people, she looks like the loyal friend who will not let the family be forgotten. There is nothing in the files yet,
that marks her as anything more than that. By 2003, the timeline is clear. Nearly 2 years have passed since Daniel and Melissa disappeared, and the investigation has produced no bodies, no confirmed crime scene, and no suspect strong enough to bring charges against. With no physical evidence to test further, and no new credible tips, the county makes an administrative decision. The Cooper case, under its formal number, is moved into cold case storage and labeled as an unsolved missing couple. It is not erased. It is placed on a different shelf, in a different category, waiting for a future event that no one can predict. The house on Riverview Lane stays locked in legal limbo, its future tied to a question that has never been answered. Lily and Noah keep building their lives in different cities, carrying a file number instead of a death certificate. Brookfield Springs, as a town, slowly turns its attention to other stories, other headlines, and other problems. The Cooper case does not end. It simply stops moving. Part 5 closes at that point where everything feels frozen. The witnesses have been interviewed, the searches have been run, the rumors have burned through the town, and still no one can say for sure what happened in that house. The file is out of sight for most people, but it is still there, waiting in a cabinet, until, years later, a statewide cold case review program will reach up, pull it back out, and ask a new set of questions about Riverview Lane. In early 2023, more than 20 years after Daniel and Melissa Cooper vanished, their names surfaced again, not in Brookfield Springs, but in a conference room at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The CBI had launched a statewide cold case review program targeting unsolved files from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Investigators were told to look for 3 things: suspicious circumstances, no bodies, and a chance that modern forensics could still say something new. When analysts worked through the lists from smaller departments, File BS 2001-092 stood out. A married couple, gone from their own home, cars in the garage, wallets left behind, no remains, no closure. On paper, it was a textbook candidate. The Cooper file landed on the desk of Detective Renee Alvarez, age 39, a member of the CBI Cold Case Unit. Alvarez had built her reputation on cases where science and paper trails did the talking. DNA, ballistics, banking records, quiet details other people had missed. When she read the short summary on the front of the file, she wrote a simple line in the margin for herself: domestic disappearance that never behaved like a normal walkaway. From there, she started at page 1 and worked forward. She read everything: the initial welfare check report, Ellison's handwritten notes from 2001, canine deployment logs, sketches of the house, neighborhood canvas sheets, tip line summaries. She studied the photographs taken inside 1435 Riverview Lane, the untouched dinner dishes, the keys hanging neatly beside the front door, the 2 vehicles in the garage. One small line in Ellison's early narrative report caught her eye and refused to go away. He noted a light smell of cleaning solution near the basement stairs, then moved on. No follow-up, no chemical tests, no photographs focused on that area. To Alvarez, that wasn't nothing. It was a thread.
She pulled the older forensic reports and saw what tools had and hadn't been used in 2001. Technicians had performed a visual search and basic fingerprint work. They had not used luminol or any other blood detection agents in the basement. There had been no ground-penetrating radar survey of the concrete slab, no subsurface imaging at all. for a missing couple last seen in that house, with no proof they ever left. That gap bothered her. In a case memo, she wrote that the cleaning agent detail was inconsistent with a normal undisturbed missing persons scene, and marked the basement as a priority if new work was ever authorized. The first step was getting back into the house. By 2023, 1435 Riverview Lane was no longer a family residence. Years of legal uncertainty had pushed it under county asset control, a property in limbo because its owners were neither confirmed dead nor confirmed alive. Alvarez met with the local district attorney's office and laid out her argument. The original investigation had never used now standard forensic tools, and there was a documented observation, cleaning solution near the basement stairs, that had never been fully explored. On that basis, she requested a new search warrant that would allow not just another walkthrough, but a full forensic re-examination of the interior, including limited destructive testing. When the warrant was signed, a modern CBI forensic team went back into the Cooper home. They treated it as if it had never been processed before. Every room was re-photographed, every doorway and hallway remeasured. In the basement, they mapped the floor, the support posts, the stairwell, the utility areas, and the walls in far more detail than the original scene documentation. Dust, debris, and any visible stains that had survived 2 decades of vacancy were collected and labeled carefully. The goal was simple: establish a baseline before any chemicals or imaging tools changed how the surfaces looked. Then they turned off the lights in the basement and began luminol testing. The solution was sprayed across sections of the concrete floor, lower portions of the walls, and the foot of the stairway. Under the right conditions, several areas reacted. Patches of floor and segments of wall glowed, telling the team that blood had once been there, even if it was no longer visible to the naked eye. Alvarez watched the documentation and noted the pattern. The reactions weren't random drips or smears you might expect from a household accident. They were clustered in a focused zone near a specific section of floor and adjacent wall. To understand what might be under that stretch of concrete, technicians brought in ground-penetrating radar. They moved the antenna slowly across the slab in a grid pattern, then studied the data. Most of the basement floor gave clean, uniform reflections. One area did not. Under a particular section, close to where the luminol reactions were strongest, the radar showed irregular subsurface reflections, the kind that suggest the concrete or soil beneath had been disturbed and then covered again. Alvarez recorded it as a structural anomaly, a neutral phrase on paper that in real life meant something about that spot was not original.
While the forensic team worked at the house, Alvarez followed the other unresolved thread: the student assistance fund Melissa had managed at Brookfield Springs Middle School. In 2001, investigators had relied on paper logs and incomplete reimbursement forms. In 2023, district banking records and accounting data could be pulled digitally. Alvarez requested transaction histories for the fund in the year leading up to the disappearance. With those spreadsheets in front of her, she could sort, filter, and compare in ways that hadn't been available 2 decades earlier. Patterns started to appear. There were repeated cash withdrawals from the fund, small enough not to scream fraud at a glance, but steady enough to matter over time. She compared the timing of those withdrawals with school calendars and internal notes, marking when Melissa was documented as reviewing those accounts or staying late to finish paperwork. The clusters matched the period colleagues had described years earlier,
when Melissa seemed unusually tense about numbers that don't make sense. One former teacher, reached again by phone, repeated almost the same phrase. She told me, if I file this exactly as it is, somebody's going to be in serious trouble. And then she kind of laughed it off, but she didn't look relaxed. Alvarez pulled these strands together into a written summary. On one side, she had a physical location, the basement and stairwell at 1435 Riverview Lane, now showing evidence of cleaned blood and subsurface irregularities that hadn't been detected in 2001. On the other side, she had a financial paper trail from the Student Assistance Fund, unexplained cash withdrawals, timing that lined up with Melissa's documented stress, and her position as one of the few people with direct access to those records. Daniel and Melissa had last been reliably placed inside that same house on the main floor and near the basement on the night of October 25, 2001. In her internal memo to supervisors and the district attorney, Alvarez argued that the totality of the new information changed the nature of the case. This was no longer just an unexplained disappearance with no bodies and no crime scene. The house now showed forensic signs of violence, and Melissa's work life held a clear possible motive for someone else. She wrote that the file should not be treated as a missing persons case anymore, but as a likely double homicide that had gone unrecognized at the time. Leadership at the CBI and the local prosecutor's office reviewed her findings. They looked at the photographs of the luminol reactions, the GPR anomaly maps, the summarized fund transactions, and the old statements from colleagues about Melissa's concerns. The decision that followed was formal but decisive. File BS 2001-092 would be reclassified. The disappearance of Daniel and Melissa Cooper was moved out of the cold case review pool and into the list of active homicide re-investigations. That change unlocked more resources, more time, and broader authority for follow-up interviews and additional forensic work. More than 20 years after the untouched dinner table was first photographed and the light smell of cleaner was mentioned and then set aside, those same details were now at the center of the case. The house on Riverview Lane and the money trail in the school district were no longer background context. They were the main focus of a renewed search for answers about what had happened to Daniel and Melissa Cooper. In 2023, the basement at 1435 Riverview Lane stopped being a line in an old report and became the center of a new investigation. Armed with a fresh warrant and clear authority to cut into the structure, the CBI forensic team went back down those concrete steps. They weren't just looking anymore. They were prepared to break the house open. Ground-penetrating radar had already shown something was off beneath a section of the slab near the stairs, a patch that did not match the rest of the floor. Now, technicians marked that anomaly with tape, set up their equipment, and began to core out the concrete, cylinder by cylinder. They lifted each section carefully, labeling and photographing as they went. Beneath the slab, they hid a layer of compacted fill that looked different from the untouched soil around it, tighter, more mixed, as if someone had disturbed it and then tried to put it back the way it was. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed like nothing. To a forensic team called in on a 22-year-old disappearance, it looked like intent.
As they sifted through that film material, the first fragments appeared. Tiny, irregular pieces of bone mixed in with gravel and dust. At first, no one said the word human out loud. The technicians did what they were trained to do. They slowed down. They brought in finer sieves, separated out anything that might matter, and logged each find. None of the pieces looked like a complete bone. There were no obvious long bones or skull fragments, but there were too many small pieces in too tight an area to ignore.
Every fragment that might be biological was sealed, labeled, and prepared for transport. The material left the house under strict chain of custody, heading straight to the lab that same day. On paper, it was described cautiously. Suspected bone fragments recovered from sub-slab disturbance. Everyone involved knew what they were hoping not to hear, but needed to. Forensic anthropologists took over next. Under magnification and specialized lighting, they examined the fragments one by one. It didn't take long for the first confirmation. The fragments were human. They weren't from an animal, and they weren't the result of natural decay in a coffin or a shallow grave. Microscopic patterns suggested force, breakage, and post-event handling. The distribution of fragments in multiple pockets under the slab lined up with something violent having happened, followed by a deliberate attempt to hide and disperse the remains. At the same time, DNA analysts were given the most promising pieces and some of the soaked substrate taken from the disturbed fill. The age of the material and the environment under the concrete had degraded the genetic material, but modern methods are designed for exactly that kind of challenge. Over time, partial profiles began to emerge. They were incomplete, but they had clear markers. Those profiles were compared to reference DNA already stored from Lily and Noah Cooper. The match was not vague. The lab concluded that the fragments were consistent with two first-degree relatives of the Cooper children, biological parents. In internal communication, the names were written plainly: Daniel and Melissa. The basement itself still had more to say. Swabs taken from the walls and floor in the luminol-positive areas were put through updated testing. Years earlier, visual inspection had found nothing. Now, even after cleaning and the passage of 2 decades, degraded blood traces could still be detected and analyzed. Again, the DNA pointed back to the same 2 people, Daniel and Melissa Cooper. The pattern wasn't just a drop or a smear. It suggested significant blood loss in that space. During a detailed physical survey of the stairwell area, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Examiners located a small metallic object embedded in the wall behind the stairs. It was easy to miss, blended into the surface and covered with years of paint and dust. Ballistics testing identified it as part of the jacket from a small-caliber handgun round. When specialists reconstructed the potential path, the angle and depth indicated a shot fired from basement floor level toward the wall, not a stray fragment from somewhere else in the house. With blood on the walls and floor, bone beneath the slab, and a bullet jacket in the wall, the forensic picture sharpened. Specialists reconstructed a likely event. At least one shot fired at close range in the basement, striking a victim and causing heavy bleeding. Cleanup efforts followed, including the use of cleaning agents noted in the original 2001 report. At some later point, the concrete slab had been cut and patched over disturbed soil where bone fragments were left behind. It was not the pattern of an accident. It was the pattern of a killing that someone tried very hard to erase. Detective Renee Alvarez brought all of this together in a comprehensive report. She documented the excavation, the lab findings, the DNA matches, the ballistics, and the reconstruction of events. In her summary, she no longer spoke in terms of possibilities. She wrote that Daniel and Melissa did not walk out of their house voluntarily. They were killed in the basement of 1435 Riverview Lane, and part of their remains were concealed beneath its floor. The manner of death, supported by ballistic evidence, was homicide by firearm. On the strength of that report, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the District Attorney's Office met to reconsider the official status of BS 2001-092. The file that had once been labeled Missing Persons, Suspicious Circumstances was formally reclassified. It became Double Homicide, Daniel and Melissa Cooper, with CBI named as the lead agency. The change wasn't just symbolic. It unlocked funding, expanded lab support, and gave Alvarez broader legal tools for subpoenas and warrants.
One of the hardest tasks came next, telling the children, now adults, what the evidence showed. Alvarez met with Lily and Noah separately, giving each of them time and space to ask questions. For more than 20 years, they had lived in a kind of suspended state, never sure whether to mourn or to hope. Now, the detective had to end that uncertainty. She explained the excavation, the bone fragments, the DNA matches, and what it meant in clear terms. Their parents had died in the basement of the family home in 2001. They had not started new lives somewhere else. They had not simply vanished into an unknown road or distant city. According to later accounts, one of the siblings said quietly, "At least now we know they didn't just choose to leave us." It wasn't relief, but it was an answer. With homicide confirmed at the house, Alvarez turned back to the question of access. Who could realistically have committed a killing in that basement, stayed long enough to clean and restructure part of the floor, and left without drawing attention? She revisited every interview from 2001, every notation about who regularly visited, who had keys, and who was in the house on that last night. The circle was small. Immediate family, a handful of close friends, and a few people connected through work. One name appeared again and again in the paperwork, not just as a visitor, but as someone tightly woven into both the Cooper home and the financial records Melissa had worried about. Karen Whitfield, school counselor, best friend, co-manager of the Student Assistance Fund, and one of the last documented visitors to 1435 Riverview Lane. For the first time, the basement was no longer just a curiosity on a map. It was a proven crime scene that held the final physical traces of Daniel and Melissa's lives. The forensic work had taken the case from a vague, haunting question, how can two people disappear from their own home, to a documented double homicide carried out in a confined space by someone with access and time. Part 7 closes at that turning point. The house has finally given up enough evidence to change the story from missing to murdered. The focus of the investigation shifts with it, narrowing from a wide net of theories to a hard look at the small group of people who could have used that basement to make the Coopers disappear, and then walked back into the community as if nothing had happened. More than 20 years after Daniel and Melissa disappeared, the investigation finally has something solid. A crime scene in the basement, and proof that what happened at 1435 Riverview Lane was not voluntary. With that foundation, Detective Renee Alvarez turns to the people who knew the Coopers best, not as teenagers in shock, but as adults who can fill in gaps the original case left open. She starts with Lily and Noah. They walk into the interview room as grown adults now, with jobs, bills, and lives built around a hole that was never filled. Alvarez doesn't ask them how they feel. She asks them what they remember. Who came to the house regularly? Who did your parents trust enough to let in without thinking twice? Who knew your routines? Both siblings, without hearing each other's answers, put the same name in the center of that circle: Karen Whitfield. For Lily, Karen was the friend who sat at their kitchen table after school events. For Noah, she was the adult who came to games,
who drove him to appointments, who never knocked more than once before stepping inside. He tells Alvarez that Karen often stayed for dinner, sometimes late. "She could walk around our house like it was hers," he says. "It never felt weird back then. She was just there." Alvarez writes it down. Karen didn't just know the family. She moved freely through their home. In a case where the crime scene is inside the basement, that level of access matters. Then, Lily brings something back from 2001 that had never fully landed in the original file. She remembers a phone call weeks before the disappearance. She was in her dorm at Colorado State University. Her mother sounded tired and distracted, talking about the Student Assistance Fund at school. Lily can't recall every word, but one line stayed with her. "If what I'm seeing is right, people are not going to trust this fund anymore." At the time, Lily thought it was workplace stress. 2 decades later, in a homicide reinvestigation centered on that same fund, the sentence lands differently. It sounds less like anxiety and more like a warning. Alvarez asks for every scrap of paperwork linked to that fund. Old file boxes are pulled from storage. Draft reports, handwritten notes, and spreadsheets come out, some yellowed, some scanned into digital archives. In one draft, Melissa has marked certain figures in red. The same amounts repeat across multiple months, small, steady withdrawals that don't line up cleanly with the stated purpose of helping students.
Melissa wasn't just worried. She was tracing something. With modern tools, Alvarez moves from paper to pixels. She gets digitized banking records from the school district and the funds account. She inputs every withdrawal made in the months leading up to October 2001 and runs timelines. The pattern appears almost immediately. Small but regular cash withdrawals, all described as reimbursements or approved expenses. Then she lines those dates up against personal banking data. Several of those reimbursements flow straight into an account belonging to Karen Whitfield, labeled as refunds or expense repayments. The amounts are not huge, but they repeat. Over time, they add up. On a spreadsheet in front of Alvarez, a line starts to form. Student assistance funds on one side, Karen's personal balance on the other. She doesn't stop there. If someone planned to hide violence inside a house, especially in a basement, the preparation would leave a footprint. Alvarez broadens the search to local hardware and home improvement stores around Brookfield Springs. Purchase records from 2001 are not always complete, but some chains kept enough data to reconstruct older transactions. One receipt stands out. Paid with Karen's debit card roughly a week before the Coopers disappeared. Cement mix, heavy-duty work gloves, and a strong cleaning chemical. The same brands and product types later appear in trace form in the Cooper basement, according to the lab. To Alvarez, it looks less like coincidence and more like planning. A store employee is tracked down and interviewed. When shown the transaction details and asked about customers from that time, he can't give a name, but he remembers a middle-aged white woman with brown hair buying heavy materials and loading them into a silver sedan. He tells Alvarez, "I just remember thinking she was buying a lot for somebody who said it was a small job." Karen, in 2001, was a middle-aged white woman with brown hair. She drove a silver sedan. On its own, that would be circumstantial. Put next to the bank transfers, Melissa's marked-up draft, and the basement evidence, it becomes another piece that fits. Next, Alvarez revisits the question of where Karen actually was on the night Daniel and Melissa vanished. The original file records Karen saying she went home after an early evening visit and stayed there. To test that, Alvarez canvasses Karen's old neighborhood. A neighbor remembers the period clearly because the case was big news back then. When asked about that night, the neighbor says Karen's car was gone from her driveway for several hours. She said she was home, the neighbor recalls, but that car wasn't there. In the old case file, Alvarez finds a brief tip from 2001 noting a similar observation, but it was never fully integrated into the main theory. Back then, with no body, no forensic proof of homicide, and dozens of rumors, it was just one more unclear note. Now, in a case where the basement has spoken, it lands much harder. With all of this lined up, Alvarez calls Karen back in. The interview is recorded. On paper, Karen is still a witness and a grieving friend. In Alvarez's mind, she's something more. Alvarez lays out the new findings: the DNA in the basement, the bone fragments, the cement and cleaning products, the withdrawals from the Student Assistance Fund, the deposits into Karen's account. She asks why so many reimbursements ended up in Karen's name. Karen says it was authorized spending, part of helping students, part of regular operations. When Alvarez asks for the matching invoices, Karen can't provide them. Questions move to the hardware store purchase. Karen says she bought materials to help a relative with some repairs, but gives no clear address or project details. When Alvarez presses on timing, why the purchase was so close to the night the Coopers vanished, Karen's answers get shorter, less steady. Then the detective walks through Karen's timeline for October 25, 2001. The early dinner at the Cooper house, the time she says she left, the claim that she stayed home afterward. As Alvarez introduces the neighbor's statement about the empty driveway, Karen begins to adjust small things in her story. Maybe she stepped out for a bit. Maybe she misremembered which night she stayed in. Each change is documented in the interview notes. In cold case work, shifting details often say more than long speeches. At this point, Alvarez has enough to ask a judge for the next step. She secures a search warrant for Karen's home and garage. The team goes in, documenting everything. In the garage, on a shelf and pushed against a wall, they find exactly what Alvarez was looking for: a partly used bag of cement mix and a bottle of industrial-strength disinfectant, the same brand and type as the materials traced in the Cooper basement.
The labels are photographed. Samples are collected. The items are boxed and sent to the lab to compare chemical signatures with the residues found under and around the basement slab. Back at her desk, Alvarez lays out the complete chain. Karen co-managed the Student Assistance Fund. Money went missing and flowed, in part, into her personal account. Melissa noticed documented irregularities and told at least one person she was worried that people would stop trusting the fund if they knew the truth. Karen had long-standing, easy access to the Cooper home and was present there on the night Daniel and Melissa were last seen alive. She bought cement and powerful cleaning agents days before they disappeared. Her car was unaccounted for during critical evening hours. Forensic work now shows that Daniel and Melissa died in their own basement, where someone tried to clean up blood and alter the structure beneath the floor. In her internal report, Alvarez writes that Karen had both motive and opportunity, a strong reason to keep Melissa quiet about the missing money, and trusted access to the place where the killings occurred. With the financial records, witness statements, hardware evidence, and Karen's shifting story in hand, Alvarez meets with the district attorney. They go through the elements one by one, testing whether the pieces are strong enough not just for suspicion, but for court. By the end of that meeting, they agree there is probable cause. Work begins on a formal arrest warrant
that will charge Karen Whitfield with double homicide and tampering with evidence, transforming her on paper from beloved school counselor and family friend into the primary suspect in the deaths of Daniel and Melissa Cooper. Part 8 ends at that turning point. For more than 2 decades, the question was where the Coopers went. Now, for the first time, the investigation centers on who made them disappear, and how that story will hold up when it is finally brought into a courtroom. The formal end of the case begins quietly with paperwork. After months of forensic work and financial analysis, Detective Renee Alvarez and the District Attorney's Office submit an affidavit laying out everything they have. The blood and DNA in the basement, the bone fragments under the slab, the missing money from the Student Assistance Fund, the hardware store receipts, and the shifting timelines. A judge reviews it and signs a warrant for the arrest of Karen Whitfield. Officers pick Karen up at her home. She's taken into custody on charges of double homicide for the deaths of Daniel and Melissa Cooper, along with tampering with evidence and fraud connected to the school fund. It's a stunning headline in Brookfield Springs. For over 20 years, Karen has been seen as a steady, reliable school counselor and the friend who kept the Coopers' memory alive. Now, she is the accused killer. At the first court appearance, Karen is brought into the county courtroom in a standard jail uniform. She stands straight, listens carefully as the charges are read, and pleads not guilty. Her attorney tells the court that the prosecution is stretching old evidence to fit a theory, and insists the state has nothing but layers of assumptions. The judge sets a future trial date and, given the severity of the charges and the long delay in justice, orders Karen held unless she can meet a very high bond. When the trial begins, the prosecution knows they don't have a confession or a living eyewitness to the shooting. What they do have is a chain of physical evidence and a clear story about motive and cover-up. They present a simple narrative. Melissa discovered that money was being siphoned from a fund meant to help students. The person benefiting was her closest friend and co-manager of that fund, Karen Whitfield. On October 25, 2001, Karen went to the Cooper home to push Melissa to stay quiet. The confrontation moved to the basement. A gun was fired. Both Daniel and Melissa were killed, and their remains and the scene itself were altered and hidden. To support that story, the state calls the forensic team first. Jurors hear in calm detail how modern equipment found an anomaly under the basement floor, how concrete was cut away, and how bone fragments were uncovered from disturbed fill underneath. Forensic anthropologists explain that the fragments are human, that they show signs of force rather than natural breakdown, and that the scattering of material is consistent with a violent event followed by deliberate concealment.
DNA analysts then walk the jury through the comparisons. Partial profiles from the bone and from blood traces on the basement wall and floor are matched to reference samples from Lily and Noah. The conclusion is direct. The genetic material comes from 2 first-degree relatives of the Cooper children, Daniel and Melissa. Combined with the luminol reactions and blood patterns, the experts state that both victims bled heavily in the basement of 1435 Riverview Lane. A ballistics expert testifies about the small metal fragment recovered from the wall behind the basement stairs. Testing shows it is part of the metal jacket from a handgun round. Based on depth and angle, the expert explains that the shot was fired from the level of the basement floor at close range, not from the upper floor. No weapon is recovered, but the bullet fragment and trajectory support the state's claim of a close-range shooting inside the house. Next, the prosecution turns the spotlight on money. A district finance officer and a school accountant present organized charts of the Student Assistance Fund. They show that in the months before October 2001, there was a pattern of small but regular withdrawals recorded as reimbursements or approved expenses. Cross-referenced with personal bank records, several of those same amounts appear as deposits into Karen Whitfield's account, labeled refunds or reimbursements. A former teacher and colleague of Melissa takes the stand. She recalls Melissa bringing her a concern late one afternoon in 2001. On the stand, she repeats the sentence that stuck with her for years. Melissa told me, "If I turn this report in the way it is, somebody's going to be in serious trouble." She looked serious. This wasn't just stress. She had found something. That line, tied to the red-marked draft reports the investigators recovered, helps the jury connect Melissa's anxiety to real numbers and a real suspect. The state then moves to the hardware store evidence. A record custodian confirms a receipt paid by Karen's debit card for cement mix, heavy-duty gloves, and a strong disinfectant about a week before the disappearance. A former employee from that store testifies that he remembers helping a middle-aged white woman with brown hair who drove a silver sedan. He admits he can't be 100% sure after so long, but the vehicle and general description match Karen. A forensic chemist finishes the picture by comparing trace samples from the bag of cement and the disinfectant bottle found in Karen's garage, with residue detected in the Cooper basement. The chemical formulas and manufacturer markers line up. To anchor the case in time and place, neighbors are called. A neighbor from Riverview Lane confirms seeing Karen's car at the Cooper home early on the evening of October 25, 2001, consistent with Noah's description of her visit before dinner. Another neighbor, this time from Karen's street, tells the jury that Karen's silver sedan was gone from her driveway for several hours that same night, even though Karen originally told police she was home the whole evening. That old tip, barely noted in 2001, now stands out as another piece of a shifting story. The defense responds by attacking the nature of the evidence itself. They tell the jury there is no surveillance video, no murder weapon, and no eyewitness to the actual shooting. They question how reliable memories can be after more than 20 years, and suggest that the scene at 1435 Riverview Lane could have been contaminated or misinterpreted after so much time and so many occupants. To humanize their client, they call former students and co-workers who describe Karen as a caring counselor and argue that, at worst, she may have been involved in sloppy bookkeeping, not murder. The most tense moments of the trial come when Karen takes the stand. Under questioning by her own attorney, she insists she never stole from the fund and never harmed Daniel or Melissa. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor pulls out her original 2001 statement, her later clarifications, and her recent interviews with Alvarez. Each time a conflict is exposed, where she once said she stayed home all night, but now concedes she might have gone out for a bit, the prosecutor pauses and lets the jury absorb the change. The prosecutor then introduces a former teacher who once considered both women close colleagues. On the stand, she says, "Melissa trusted her. We all did. That's what makes this so hard to accept." That simple sentence underscores the theme of betrayal that runs under the entire case. After closing arguments, the judge instructs the jury on how to weigh circumstantial evidence. The jurors retire with binders of reports, photo boards of the basement, timelines of bank withdrawals, and charts of Karen's movements on October 25th. When they return, their verdict is read slowly. Guilty of murder in the first degree for Daniel Cooper.
Guilty of murder in the first degree for Melissa Cooper. Guilty of tampering with evidence. Guilty of financial fraud connected to the Student Assistance Fund. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor argues for the maximum. He points out that Karen used her position in a school and in a family to steal money meant for children, then killed the one person who tried to stop it and the husband who stood in the way. Lily and Noah choose brief statements. Lily tells the court, "We just want the record to show what really happened. Our parents didn't run away. They were taken from us." Noah adds that he wants people to remember that his parents were victims of a crime, not characters in a rumor.
The judge imposes life sentences for each murder conviction, along with additional time for the evidence tampering and fraud counts. The exact structure of the terms is less important than the message. Karen Whitfield will spend the rest of her life under correctional control. With that, the case file is formally closed under a new title, The Riverview Lane Double Homicide, File BS, 2000-1092-R23, classified as Offender Identified and Convicted. The Brookfield Springs School District implements stricter rules on who can control internal funds and how often financial reviews must be done. For people in town, the story becomes a warning that the most dangerous person in a case is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it is the trusted friend sitting at the table, the counselor in the hallway, the person organizing the memorial. More than 20 years after Daniel and Melissa Cooper were last seen alive, the combination of forensic science, financial records, and patient cold casework finally forces the truth into daylight. If you've stayed with this case to the end, let me know what you think in the comments about the verdict, the sentence, and the way this investigation was handled. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who follows true crime stories. Your support helps bring more long-buried cases like this back into the light.